Well, hello. So we are in a weird place. As I told you at the start of the semester, history is all around us. We move amongst it every minute of every day. We are making history every moment of every day. We're just not conscious of it. And given what's going on in the world right now with the pandemic, it is a time when we are very conscious of the fact that we are living in a historical moment that is going to be studied and recorded and taught from this point forward. And that gives us a chance, I think, to pause and think about what it must have been like to go through the American Revolution, to go through the uncertainty of the period that we're going to talk about here this evening, the period of the Articles of Confederation, the forming of the Constitution. People lived through tumultuous times in that period, and Americans and the world have lived through tumultuous times over and over again, where there was uncertainty, there was social and economic disruption, when people were frightened, they were afraid, they weren't sure how things were going to work out. And so you can take what's going on today in our own world and sort of extrapolate that into the past and begin to get a little bit of sense of what it must have been like to actually live through the things that we are talking about, at least a little bit. So from this point forward, until further notice, our class is going to be held online. My plan is to videotape the lectures, put them on YouTube so that you can watch them. Perhaps a lot more pleasant doing that way than having to sit in your chair in the classroom at Riverside for almost 3 hours at a go. This way you can pause, you can rewind, you can revisit, you can handle this however you want. The only thing that I'm going to encourage you to do is to watch at least one video a week. Because you don't want to fall behind. And to encourage you to do that, I am going to be posting, or rather posing during the lectures, some questions, maybe 3 or 4 questions at irregular intervals in the lecture that I will want you to answer in an email to me, okay? So that way I know that you have been attending class. I know that you've been listening to the lectures, that you're listening to the entirety of the lecture, getting all of the information, and the scores for these questions that I'm going to ask you are basically going to get cobbled together and become the objective portion of your test. And since you can rewind and look at the video over and over and over again, I would suspect that everybody will be able to do that as satisfactory, and that the grades will therefore be good. In terms of the essay questions for your test, basically we're going to stick with what we've been doing. I'm going to make this open book since there's not really a convenient way, and especially not in the condensed time period that we have, to do it in any other fashion. So it'll be an open book test. You'll have 2 questions just like you did before. The only difference is that it will not be a timed test taken in class, obviously. So you will have up to a week to write up an answer and email that answer to me. The format and what you're required to do is exactly the same as the written test in class, but since you will be typing it and you will have multiple time, lots of times to do it, you'll be able to look at your book and look at the notes and look at the videos and that kind of thing. Then I'm going to have a higher bar on accuracy. You're going to need to make sure you use grammar and spell check so that we are presenting papers that are properly structured, properly spelled, properly written, that sort of thing. That's all going to become part of it now. So that will increase the difficulty a little bit, but since you're going to have lots of time to do these and you're going to have plenty of opportunity to check your information, that sort of stuff, then this too I expect will make your performance better. Your grades will go up. Not a bad thing as far as you're concerned. If If you're learning the material and coming to understand and appreciate it, that's all that really matters to me. We will stick with our improvement system. So if your grades are improving over the course of the semester, as they most assuredly should be, then you will have your last test be your best test grade, and that will become your course grade. So that is where we are. We have lost a week of class. Of course, that's very painful. It's going to make it hard to get through everything that we have to get through. I will try my best to get us where we need to go, but this will mean that we're going to condense a lot of the information. We're going to simplify it and leave out a lot of detail. We're going to skip over more than we would have done typically. And I'm also not going to promise you, or should it be, I'm not going to threaten you with 3-hour videotape lectures. It'd be probably a little bit tedious to watch. So I get through the material that I want to get through in a given video, no matter how long that takes us. Then we'll be done with that section, with that chapter of our book, so to speak. So you will be getting stuff from me on Blackboard that will be emailed to you, so you need to pay attention to that. Email is going to be our primary way to communicate with each other, and some of you have already reached out to me by email. That's great. Those of you who haven't need to do so, so that we can try and make this work as best we can, continue with the class, continue with our assignments, continue with the education, and continue pushing you along in your academic career. So when we left off before spring break, which now seems like a very long time ago, we had finished the American Revolution. We had talked about the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, and now we're going to swing into chapter 6, which is what this lecture is going to cover. I'm going to talk about how America accomplishes its goals in an era post-war, in an era of peace. So some of this is that we're going to talk about in the beginning, predates the Battle of Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. But that's sort of a precursor to kind of get us to the main act in this lecture, which is the Constitutional Convention, the writing of a new Constitution for the United States, and its ratification and the establishment of a new government. So we've had an American Revolution, and that is a war that has been won at great cost by the 13 colonies, now 13 states, part of a United States of America. And 2% of the population had died during the Revolutionary War. And of course, there had been massive disruptions of society and the economy and these sorts of things. But one of the interesting things about the American Revolution is that when you look backward at it and you try and find real revolution, it's kind of difficult to do. Remember that the kind of revolution the Americans were after at Lexington and Concord was not the overthrow of the established order, not the overthrow of the British monarchy. They weren't trying to bring about the downfall of the economy or the society or something like that. They were actually trying to preserve it. They were trying to turn the clock backward. Remember, a revolution is the completion of a single circle. They were trying to turn the clock back to 1763, at the moment of great victory for England and her colonies over the French and her colonies and the Spanish and her colonies in the French and Indian War, before the proclamation of 1763 and the debate over who should pay for what and who should get what out of the French and Indian War, and then all of the taxes and the protest against taxes and all of that sort of thing. So in a lot of ways, the American Revolution began for pretty conservative reasons. And if we keep that in mind, then it makes sense that when we look for real revolution, it's a little bit hard to get a hold of in American history. So how revolutionary was the American Revolution? Well, if you look at things like, say, the economy, there's not much revolution there. The colonies were primarily rural and agricultural before the war. They are primarily rural and agricultural estates after the war. Before the war, the focus of American trade was on England. And as soon as the war is over and the Treaty of Paris is ratified in September 1783, the focus of American trade goes back to England. About 75% of all American trade is with Great Britain after the war, and 25% is with other nations. And that really doesn't represent much of a change, because remember, before the war, there was a great deal of smuggling and illicit trade that was going on. And although we can't quantify that, if we had to make a guess, we would probably say that 75% of American trade was being legally conducted within the British Empire before the American Revolution, and 25% was probably being illegally conducted with France and Spain and Portugal and Holland and that sort of stuff before the American Revolution. So there's not really much change there economically. In terms of legal systems, the United States is still going to hold on to basically the British structure that the colonists had brought with them from Europe. So the whole idea of judges and juries and grand juries and petite juries and the writ of habeas corpus and trial by your peers and that kind of thing, that all came to North America courtesy of English colonists. And although you do get rid of some British laws, like primogeniture, remember what that is? It says that when you die, you have to leave all of your land to your oldest son. And entail, which says basically that you can't divvy up your land while you're alive. These were laws that existed in England to ensure that the large landed estates stayed together, and those large landed estates, of course, were the basis of the economic power that allowed the elite to maintain political power. Those laws had come to America with the colonists, but they'd never really been enforced here, and for a very good reason, and that reason was that the thing that made them necessary in England, very limited amount of good land, that was not a problem in America. There was limitless land as far as an English colonist was concerned, and so those laws were on the book, but they were not enforced. And after the Revolution, those laws were gotten rid of, but how important is it that a law that was never enforced is actually stricken from the record? Of course, it doesn't make very much of a difference at all. In terms of religion, it seemed like there was the beginning, at least, of revolution. The colonies, now becoming states, disestablish religion. And Thomas Jefferson, as governor of Virginia, led the way to doing this first. And basically, by disestablishing religion, you say there is no longer an official state religion, as there had been in every colony. It had been Anglican in Virginia, and it had been Puritan in Massachusetts, for example. Now, there is no preference given to any religion. No religion gets official sanction or official support from the government. And of course, this is a very pragmatic thing to do, because there were so many different types of religions that had come to America, that had grown in America, evolved in America. How are you going to pick one? How are you going to pick one? And so religion is disestablished, but how much of a real change does that make in people's daily lives? And the answer is not much, because the importance of religion in daily life doesn't change at all. People still went to church on Sunday, sometimes other days of the week. They still prayed to their God for assistance and grace. They prayed before their meals. They prayed at the beginning of public meetings. Legislatures had prayers at the beginning of their sessions, and political leaders evoked the benevolence of the Almighty in all of their endeavors. And so the importance, the centrality of religion, that doesn't change at all. Now, we've begun a process that will ultimately lead to many decades later. In fact, we're talking about getting into the 20th century. It will lead to the concept of a separation of church and state. But that is a long way in the future. So the disestablishment of religion is the planting of a seed that will, in time, be meaningful, but in the short run, doesn't really make any difference whatsoever. What about labor systems? Do labor systems change as a result of the American Revolution? And here again, the answer is mixed, because before the American Revolution, most people lived on farms, or they ran small shops, small businesses, and the family was the primary labor force. That doesn't change because of the American Revolution. The one place where you do begin to get a change in labor systems revolves around the institution of slavery. Remember, slavery was a universal institution in British colonial America. Slavery existed in all 13 colonies. Its percentages were different. Remember, 60% of the population of South Carolina was slave, 40% of the population of Virginia was slave, 8% of the population of Pennsylvania was slave, and only 3% of the population of Massachusetts was slave. But nonetheless, slavery and the laws and the cultural construct that made slavery based on skin color possible, that was something that every colony shared. There was, of course, a certain contradiction in the idea of declaring, as we did in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and continuing to own slaves. And some states recognized that very early on, and so states like Vermont, for example, and New Jersey, they begin to lead the way in abolishing slavery, in getting rid of slavery. Now, this happened over a long period of time, and where it happened almost exclusively in the northern colonies, above the Mason-Dixon line, which is the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania. In other words, where you have the fewest number of slaves, and they were least important to the economy, is where you got abolition. But abolition, which takes place over a number of years, different colonies do it at different times, does not, in fact, free very many slaves, because in most instances, slavery was abolished gradually. And this makes sense because if we remember, slavery is primarily an economic institution. And that means slaves are property, and they're very valuable property. They are both the labor and the machinery of production. And so if someone had spent a lot of money buying a slave, and the government was suddenly going to walk in and say, you can no longer own that slave, you are taking away somebody's investment, you're taking away somebody's means of making a living, you're taking away something valuable that's an asset that they can leave to their children, that they can sell if they come on economic hard times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we put this into a modern context, for example, say that the government came in and said, to combat global warming, we're going to make it illegal now for anybody to own an automobile. So tomorrow we're going to confiscate all the trucks, all the cars, all the motorcycles. We're going to take them all away. You probably wouldn't be happy about that, would you? Because you spent a lot of money buying that vehicle. You took out a loan that you're still paying and paying interest on. To buy that vehicle. And as a consequence of the government taking away, you no longer have use of that vehicle to get to school, to get to work, to go on a date or something like that. So your ability to travel, your freedom to travel, your ability to get to work and make a living has now been seriously disrupted by government edict. And on top of that, the loan, of course, that you took out to pay for the car, well, that doesn't go away because the car goes away. The company that lent you that money still expects you to pay it back and pay it back with interest. And so we would not be very happy about that. And if you simply substitute slave for car, it's the same kind of thing. And no government wants to make its citizens angry in that fashion. And so the way that slavery was done away with was gradual. And New Jersey, for example, sets up a really good paradigm. And what they did in New Jersey is to say that slave children will become free when they each reach the age of 21. So if you had a slave who was 21 or older, you could keep that slave until they died. You could enjoy their labor until they died. You could reap the benefit of your investment in purchasing that slave until the slave passed away. But if that slave had children, those children who are a less mature asset, so to speak, they become free when they get to the age of 21. So over a generation, you basically plan to eliminate slavery. The difficulty, of course, here is that if you're a slaveholder, are you going to wait around for your young slaves to reach maturity and then throw them a big party and say, oh, congratulations, today you're free? It's very unlikely that that's what's going to happen, right? So it would make a lot more sense to take this economic asset of a maturing slave and either move south where you could keep the slave or sell the slave south and reap an economic windfall from that transaction. And so although slavery gradually is abolished in the Middle and the New England states, very few slaves are freed as a result of that, so the immediate impact is pretty minimal. But like religion, the long-term impact is very important because we begin to set up a system where slavery is going to be done away with in the North, where it is economically least important and where the numbers of slaves are smallest, but in the South, where the numbers of slaves are very large, where slavery is economically vital and also a means to control a population that is not considered equal by white Southerners, and a population that they believe must be controlled in order to remain in America, you don't get rid of slavery there. So in terms of religion, in terms of economics, in terms of labor systems, in terms of law, in terms of trade, where's the revolution? Doesn't seem to be there, right? Doesn't seem to be there. And to the extent it is there, the changes are simply put into motion, and they're going to take a long time to actually build up steam. There is, however, one place where the revolution was immediate, and it was dramatic, and it was obvious, and that is in systems of government. Because what was the American Revolution if it was not a protest over the way that British colonists in the New World were being governed by England, or the way England was attempting to govern them? And so as soon as you had the Declaration of Independence, you had a problem. And that problem stems from the fact that the legal basis for the existence of every colony and every colonial government was a royal charter, permission from the King of England for a group of people, or in the case of, say, Pennsylvania, William Penn, a proprietor, to establish a colony. And so when you suddenly are no longer part of England, when you dissolve all the bonds between America and England, then you have made those royal charters moot. They no longer form the legal basis to establish government. And so you have to replace that. And the Second Continental Congress, which had declared American independence, sent a notice to the states that you need to come up with a replacement for these royal charters. And what every state did was to assemble its legislature and to draft a written constitution. And here's where you get real, significant, immediate revolutionary change, because every state produced a written constitution. Now, from our vantage point in 2020, that doesn't seem all that extraordinary, right? Constitutions are written things, aren't they? They are documents that can be referenced and looked at. But when the states began to write these constitutions and ratify these constitutions and put these constitutions into effect, this is something that had never really been done before in human history. And so for the very first time, you were writing down the structure of the government, but more than that, you were writing down the calendar of elections, and you were writing down the powers of that government. And in almost every state, you were also writing down the rights of the citizen. Virtually every one of these constitutions included specific declarations of rights. And here we see a very evident reaction to the problems that had led to the American Revolution. Because remember, the American Revolution, the American colonists had said, hey, we have certain rights, and the British had said, no, you don't. And the British government had said we had certain powers, and the colonists had said, no, you don't. And because Britain lacked a written constitution, there was no way to adjudicate that. There was no document to go to and say, no, see, right here on page 2, it says we have these rights, or here on page 5, it says the government has these powers. And since you could not resolve this dispute in a legal way, it had been resolved in a military fashion. And so the colonies now become states, of course, remember that very acutely, and they're going to try and correct that problem. So written state constitutions, specific declarations of rights, are a clear reaction to the problems that had brought on the American Revolution. And in some states, this goes much further because the colonial governments had all sort of been mini representations of Britain's government, right? So in England, you had the king, and then you had a two-branch parliament. And in the colonies, you had a governor who was sort of a mini king, and you had a colonial legislature, and it typically had two branches. So it's the stand-in for the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And so if you're rejecting all things British, then you want to reject this British system of government as well. And in some states, like Georgia, for example, they got rid of the office of governor completely. There was no governor. And where governors were retained in almost every state, not all of them, but in almost every state, they had no power to make political appointments. They had no power to veto. The governor was stripped of almost all executive function. Because the primary lesson that Americans are carrying out of the revolution is simply this: power corrupts. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so we're going to reduce the power of governors, or eliminate it. And we're going to reduce the power of legislatures, and most of these legislatures are going to be elected for a year, so you're kind of always in perpetual campaign, and we're going to reduce the ability of government to become a tyrant, which is what we believed England had become in the lead up to the American Revolution. And even though all of this is a reaction to the events that had led to the outbreak of war, it is true revolutionary change. Real revolutionary change. And of course, it's not just the states who have to come up with a new system of government. The Second Continental Congress, remember, had never been intended to be a national government. It had sort of accidentally inherited the job when it came back into session in May of 1785, a month after Lexington and Concord, and it had come into session for the purpose of checking up on the Continental Association. How are those economic sanctions against England working out? Do we need to do more? And of course, it finds itself saddled with the war and becomes the de facto national government. It has to raise an army and a navy and fund the war and do all these sorts of things. And that was a task for which it was very ill-suited because it didn't have much power. And the states were calling the shots, and the states were constantly squabbling and arguing with each other. There was a great deal of suspicion about centralizing political power because, of course, Britain had centralized political power. Look how well that had worked out. And so the Second Continental Congress had been a very poor instrument to wage a war against one of the mightiest powers on the face of the planet. It's remarkable that it did as well as it did, but it constantly gave people like George Washington fits because it couldn't come up with money to pay the troops or to buy them uniforms or ammunition or to set up hospitals and these sorts of things. And of course, the members of the Second Continental Congress recognized we were not created to be a government. And so as soon as the Declaration of Independence was sort of codified and word had gone out to the states, you need to come up with a new basis for your political establishment. The Second Continental Congress tried to write itself out of a job. And it did that by creating what you can call the first Constitution of the United States, and that was a document written in 1777 known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were themselves a reaction to the problems that had caused the American Revolution. So just as the states had taken the pendulum from a very strong centralized government that they saw in England, and they swung it all the way to the other end of the spectrum to create very weak government. This was even more so the case with the Articles of Confederation, which were deliberately designed to be a weak form of central government. And remember, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so the new states forming the United States of America don't want to jump out of the frying pan and into the fire. They're not going to recreate the very kind of government that they are even then rebelling against. So in the Articles of Confederation, you have a system that is very similar to what you had in the Second Continental Congress. And the sort of a tell here is the name of the founding document, the Articles of Confederation. What we call things, remember, matters, and it matters a great deal. And a confederation is defined as a loose association. It's a loose grouping together in which the individual components have a great deal of sovereignty, have a great deal of leeway, a great deal of power. It's very different than a union. And although the word union is sometimes used, the word confederation and confederacy are used far more often. So think of a confederation or a confederacy as joining a club, or let's say a friendship. So you want to become friends with somebody. That's easy to do, right? You just decide, hey, we're going to be friends. You don't have to fill out any paperwork. You don't have to have a blood test. You don't go see lawyers or have something notarized or codified in a court of law. You can be any kind of friend that you want. You can be close friends, casual friends, BFFs. You can be, workout buddies. You can be friends with benefits if you want. But you can be any kind of friend you want, and you get to stay in that friendship as long as that friendship is beneficial to you, as long as you get something out of that friendship. But if you decide at some point that that friendship's not working out, it's no longer convenient, or you suspect that your friend is being dishonest with you, or stealing money from you, or hitting on your significant other, or whatever the reason is, you can end the friendship. And you can end it just like that. You say, we're no longer friends. I don't want to talk to you. I'm not going to email you. I'm not going to text you anymore. We're done. We're through. And again, there is nothing that you have to do, legally speaking, to bring that friendship to an end. You contrast, therefore, confederation to a union. And a union is supposed to be more like a marriage, or at least the idea of what marriage is. And marriage is until death do you part, forever after. A marriage is something you're supposed to commit yourself to, something where you're supposed to share duties and responsibilities and benefits equally. Excuse me. A marriage is something that is difficult to get into. So, you want to get married? There are documents to fill out. There are legal ramifications to a marriage. You have to have some sort of ceremony, either in front of a religious official or a government official or something like that. Your property is merged together once you're married. And if for some reason that marriage is going to break up, getting out of a marriage is even harder than getting into it. It involves lawyers and judges and courts and splitting of assets and custody disputes over children or pets and these sorts of things. And so a union is something that's supposed to be everlasting, whereas a confederation is really something more of convenience. And in a confederation, both all the parties are basically able to bolt at any time. And so when we say the Articles of Confederation, the states are basically telling you how they're going to approach this government, which is not dissimilar to how they approach the government, the de facto government of the Second Continental Congress. The states are in charge, and the national government is their servant, not the other way around. And the national government is not going to have very much power. And if you look at the structure of the Articles of Confederation, you see great similarities to the structure of the Second Continental Congress. So there will be no executive branch, no court system of any kind, even though the Congress elects somebody to sort of be the head, and he's called the President of the United States. He doesn't have executive authority. He's just sort of the guy who, does the administrative functions that are necessary to run any group, organized body of people. So there's no executive, which means, of course, there's no power of appointment. There is no power of veto whatsoever. The government will consist of a single legislative branch, a unicameral, if you prefer, legislative body. And just as had been the case in the Second Continental Congress, every state gets one vote. One state, one vote, equal representation. So it doesn't matter how big the state is, it doesn't matter how populous the state is, it doesn't matter how rich the state is, every state is equal. Rhode Island has the same vote as New York, Delaware the same vote as Pennsylvania, New Hampshire the same vote as Virginia or Massachusetts. A state could send however many delegates it wants to the Congress. So the idea here is that, hey, you can gather together your best men and they can go forward to Philadelphia and they can represent your state. But you better send an odd number, because if you send an equal number, say you sent 4 delegates and they divide 2 to 2 on a question, then your state would lose its vote. So you want to make sure you have an odd number so that your delegation could actually lean one way or the other. This new legislature, known as the Congress of the Confederation, was not going to have very much power. It had no power to levy taxes. It had no power to levy tariffs. After all, these are the kinds of things that had gotten everyone all excited on the lead up to the Revolutionary War. It would serve a term of 1 year, which meant that you were always electing one way or another a new Congress. And if this Congress wanted to pass what was called ordinary legislation, that's something mundane, then it required a simple majority vote. But if you wanted to pass key legislation, the stuff that mattered, things about economies or war or trade or diplomacy, the really important stuff, you had to have a 2/3 majority vote. That meant 9 out of 13 states had to assent before you could do something. And if you wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, put something in, take something out, that required the unanimous consent of all 13 states. And of course, unanimity in politics is extremely rare and difficult to achieve. And so clearly we have a recipe here for a government that is not going to be much better than the Second Continental Congress, even given all the problems the Second Continental Congress had experienced during the Revolutionary War. And even then, the idea of the Articles of Confederation was not popular. There were a lot of states that pushed back against it. They didn't like it. They thought it gave too many prerogatives to the national government. They thought that the government had too much power. And as a consequence of that, it was not until March 1st of 1781 that the last state needed to ratify the Articles of Confederation actually did so. So basically, you went through the entire Revolutionary War without a purpose-built government. You were stuck with the Second Continental Congress. Remember, March of 1781 is only a handful of months away from the September through October Battle of Yorktown that same year that basically brings the Revolutionary War to an end. And so the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation, the Congress of the Confederation aren't really there for us during the Revolutionary War, but they're going to be there for us in the period of peace that follows. And they're going to be there during that awkward period between the end of the fighting in October of 1781 and the actual ratification of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And although we think of Yorktown as ending the war, of course, it only ended the major operations. Technically speaking, we were still at war. Washington's army had to remain in the field. That army had to be fed, uniformed, clothed, trained. And so you've got this kind of strange period that's floating around here. As one might expect, the Congress of the Confederation was not very successful. It did not do well. It did accomplish some things. The western lands claimed by the various colonies before they became states were a real source of dispute. One of the reasons it took so long to ratify the document, because those claims overlapped. Pennsylvania and Virginia both can't have the Ohio River Valley, for example. And the way that this was resolved is all the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains was surrendered by the states to the national government. So nobody got anything west of those mountains, and that allowed the national government to act on how that territory was going to be settled. And so one of the things that the Congress of the Confederation manages to accomplish is the passage of the Land Ordinance of 1785. And what the Land Ordinance of 1785 did was pretty important. It established territories in the West. It sort of drew territories in the West, and it laid out the system by which land could be sold in those territories so people could actually go legally live there. And it established a method by which territories would be governed and then become states. So the land west of the Appalachians is not going to become colonies. It's going to be put on the road to statehood. And once a territory had 5,000 people, it could have a territorial legislature and limited self-government. When it got to 60,000 people, it could hold a convention, write a state constitution, and as long as that state constitution was a Republican form of government, a democratic form of government, if you will, then it could submit that constitution to the Congress, and if the Congress approved it, then the territory became a state. It entered the Union with all the rights and prerogatives that go along with being a state. So that's pretty important. The other thing that the Congress of the Confederation managed to accomplish that's going to be meaningful going forward is the passage of the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. Now remember, the Treaty of Paris is going to give the United States all the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi. And that meant that the original northwest corner of the country is what today we call the Midwest. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. That's what we call the Midwest in 2020. And if you ever wondered about that, you ever wonder why we call that the Midwest? Because is that in the middle of the West as we understand it in America today? And of course the answer is no. The middle of the West would be like Nevada and Utah and Montana and that kind of thing. And yet this piece of the country below the Great Lakes and above the Ohio River is called the Midwest. Well, the reason for that is that as the country was originally constituted, it was the northwestern corner of the United States. And when the United States expands beyond the Mississippi, then it stops being the Northwest, and the Northwest becomes what it is today, Washington and Oregon and Idaho and that sort of thing. But people had spent their whole lives calling it the Northwest, and so you just shifted the term, it becomes the Midwest. And what the Northwest Ordinance does is to ban slavery above the Ohio River. It bans slavery above the Ohio River in what will become the states of Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin and ultimately Minnesota as well. And the reason that this was done was not some moral objection to the institution of slavery, because most people didn't have a moral objection to the institution of slavery. There were, of course, people who did, and the people believed it should be done away with, but the real objection to slavery by most people was economic. And so as the country is going to move west, you're basically going to get a system where Southerners are going to go straight west, Northerners are going to go straight west, and therefore they're going to find the same climate, soil, and geography that they came from, which means they're going to replicate settlement patterns and economic patterns and labor systems and these sorts of things. And so you're not going to get cash crops in the Northwest Territory, and therefore you don't really need slavery. Family labor is going to do just fine, and therefore the Americans who moved into that territory did not want to compete with slave labor, because slave labor depresses wages. It's economic competition, and so the Congress decides to disallow slavery from going there. And this is important because basically, it continues this line of a free North versus a slave South. Notable that where climate, soil, and geography was conducive to cash crops, that is below the Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and what will become Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, slavery is not abolished. It's economically too important, and the Southerners who are moving into those territories need the economic advantages of slavery to begin cash crop economies. So you again set something in motion that's going to become very important later on. But at the time, it wasn't really considered controversial because most Americans, North and South, believed that slavery was really on its way out. It's going to die out. And the tobacco boom that had relied so much on slave labor has long since gone bust. It's really, faded as the economic engine to the South. And although there might be, some future crop that would need slave labor to be profitable, it was hard to imagine what that would be. You could use slavery to grow rice or sugar cane in the South, but you could only grow those in certain regions and in certain kinds of climate, and so it wasn't going to replace tobacco. Cotton was a possibility, but the difficulty with cotton was that to separate the flax from the seed was extremely labor intensive, and you couldn't grow very much and separate the flax from the seed quickly enough to make it really profitable. And so if slavery isn't really needed for mass tobacco production, then its importance is fading. It's going to die out, and when it dies out, we'll all be glad that it dies out. We don't know when exactly it's going to die out. We don't know how exactly it's going to die out. We haven't answered the question of what we're going to do with all the slaves once they're no longer needed as slaves. These are things that the future will have to cope with. But if slavery is going to die out, why pollute the northwestern corner of the country with the institution, especially if the people who are going to move there don't want it and they don't need it? So the Land Ordinance of 1785, the Northwest Ordinance, those are important accomplishments by the Congress of Confederation, but they're almost the only accomplishments of the Congress of Confederation. Its inability to wield true power would be its undoing. So it couldn't do anything to manage the economy. And the economy, of course, is a wreck after the Revolutionary War. We hadn't had much in the way of gold and silver when the war started. What we did have went to pay for the war. There was even less, therefore, when the war was over. And what there was instantly crossed the Atlantic Ocean to buy goods that Americans had been cut off from for the duration of the conflict. And this had been a problem during the war and had led the Congress and the states to try and fund the revolutionary struggle by begging for loans from France and Holland and Spain, but even more so by printing paper money. And of course, paper money was supposed to be a more convenient method of transaction than using gold and silver coin. Gold and silver coins are bulky and they're heavy. Paper is lighter and easier to carry around in large quantities. But the only thing that made paper worth anything was your ability to go in and take a paper dollar bill and take it to a bank and exchange it for the real thing, which would be a gold dollar coin or a silver dollar coin. And as long as you could do that and you knew that you could do it, you felt secure in always being able to change the paper for the real thing, then you were content to use the paper. But of course, this kind of constrains the government to make sure that the balance of paper to specie, the gold or silver coin, is pretty close to 1-to-1. You don't have to actually be 1-to-1, but you got to be pretty close to that, because if you start to print more paper dollars than you have gold or silver dollars, you're going to get in trouble very quickly. And this is what happened. The need for more and more money to run the economy, to fight the war, continually increased. The amount of gold and silver was continually decreasing. And so therefore you began to print not one paper dollar for every gold dollar, not two for every gold, but 10, and then 20, and then 50, and 100. And the more and more of these paper dollars that you printed, the less and less valuable they became, because they were all propped up by a finite amount of gold and silver. So let's keep it really simple, if you have 10 paper dollars for every gold dollar, then you don't have enough gold for everybody to go turn those paper dollars in. And what that means is that essentially those paper dollars aren't really worth $1 in gold, they're worth 10 cents in gold, okay? And so you get deflation of the currency. The money becomes less and less and less valuable, but the commodity in the marketplace that you want to buy, that stays the same. So if I think a Snickers bar is worth $1 in gold, and you want to bring me $1 in gold, I'll sell you my Snickers bar. If you want to buy my Snickers bar with paper money, and that paper money is really worth only 10 cents in gold, then I want 10 paper dollars for my Snickers bar, right? And that's inflation. So as the value of the currency goes down, the value of commodities stays the same, the price of goods goes way up. And so in the new United States, there was hyperinflation. And that was a problem. And people expect the government to manage economies. Even in the 1780s, people expected governments to manage economies, at least to some degree, not to the extent that they do now, but to some degree. And so there was a great clamor for the government to fix the problem. The difficulty, of course, is that this new Congress of the Confederation couldn't fix the problem. It had no regulatory authority over the currency whatsoever. The states were all printing their own paper money. The Continental Congress had printed its paper money, which is called Continental. So you have 14 different currencies that are floating around out there. And the more paper there is, then the less valuable all that paper becomes. And the Congress decided that it would take a first stab at solving this problem of deflation and inflation by withdrawing the Continentals from circulation. So as Continentals were used to pay taxes or fees or something like that, Congress asked the states to withdraw them from circulation. So we'll go from 14 currencies to 13 currencies, and the division of paper to gold or silver will be a little less, and we'll stop the downward decline of the currency. But Congress couldn't make the states do that. And therefore, the states refused to do it. They not only refused to withdraw the Continentals, they started printing more of their own paper money because they said, hey, we've got a horrible inflation. People don't need less money now. They need more money. And so the problem got worse instead of better, and the national government, the Congress of the Confederation, was helpless to do anything about it. Another place where the national government was helpless was in terms of diplomacy. So remember, the Treaty of Paris gave all these goodies to the United States: independence for the 13 colonies, all that land between the Atlantic and the Mississippi, north of Florida, which goes back to the Spanish, and south of Canada, which of course the British keep. We get the fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, and in exchange for that, all the United States government had to promise was to compensate loyalists for their losses during the war and to place no legal barrier in the path of British merchants who wanted to attempt the collection of pre-war debts from former colonists. Now, the United States government is incapable of keeping those promises. It's incapable of keeping those promises because, first, it has no money to compensate anybody for anything. As we're going to find out, it can't even pay the Continental Army of George Washington. And so if the national government can't compensate the loyalists, it's going to have to look to the states to compensate the loyalists. So without a tariff and without taxes, there was no way for the national government to raise money except selling land out west. And because it wanted to sell the land out west for gold or silver, it wasn't selling very much of it. And so if the government cannot raise money, it's got to beg for it from the states. And the states can give as much as is asked for, which of course hardly ever happened. They can give more than was asked for, which never happened. Or they could give less than was asked for, which happened quite a bit. Or they could just delay. And so there's no money. There's no money. And that's done on purpose because a government that does not have money, because it cannot tax or levy tariffs, has a hard time maintaining an army and a navy. It has a hard time building a national police force. And since the former colonists believed that those were all instruments of central government tyranny, they were very happy with a government that had no money to maintain an army or a navy. But of course, this is a problem when you've promised to compensate loyalists. You can't do it. Therefore, you have to rely on the states to do it. And the states hadn't signed that treaty with England, had they? They were not signatories to the Treaty of Paris, and they looked at their voters, and they knew that their voters had no interest whatsoever in compensating loyalists. So there was no compensation. So the United States is not living up to the Treaty of Paris. And in terms of placing no barrier in front of British merchants who want to collect pre-war debts, well, the United States didn't do that, but the states did. And the national government couldn't make the states abide by the terms of the Treaty of Paris. And the consequences of this were pretty serious because the British aren't very happy with us after the Revolutionary War. There's a lot of bitterness and a lot of resentment. They're not allowing American ships to trade with their colonies in the Caribbean. And so, that's hobbling the economy. But the British look at our refusal to abide by the terms of the treaty and say, okay, well, if you're not going to abide by those terms, we're not going to abide by those terms either. And so they refused to withdraw British troops who were stationed in forts along the southern borders of the Great Lakes in what is now officially American territory. So the British retaliated, basically, and whatever their justification for a national government, this is a problem. You have foreign troops on your soil, and that's simply something you cannot continent because the reason that countries come into existence in the first place is territorial defense, is to keep people on that side of the river from coming to this side of the river and taking our stuff. So whether the British are right or wrong to have those troops there, it's up to the United States government to push them out. The difficulty, of course, is that means a military campaign. It risks war, and there's no money for a military campaign. There's certainly no money for a big war. We barely escaped with victory in our last fight against the British. There's virtually no Navy anymore. And what there is, the Army, a few thousand men, is sitting in Newburgh, New York, under Washington, unpaid, barely uniformed, barely fed. It's in no condition to go out and do anything. And so you simply have to acquiesce to this British occupation of American territory. So here's the national government, the Congress of Confederation, newly created, and it cannot manage America's economy, it cannot manage America's diplomacy, it cannot manage America's defense. Nobody has much confidence in it. There's a lot of suspicion about it. It looks incompetent, it looks worthless, and this leaves a lot of room for the states to do the thing that, for the most part, the states wanted to do anyway, is run their own affairs and in their own way. And remember this back in the period of the colonial wars and stuff like this has always been the tendency of the individual colonies. They can come together and work alongside each other for a very brief period of time, but only so long as it's in their narrow self-interest, and what some people would say their narrow selfish interest, why it's a confederation and not a union. And of course, this just is going to lead from problem to problem to problem. And in a way, the culmination of all of that comes in March of 1783. So the Treaty of Paris is being finalized by negotiators. It's going to be ratified in September of that year. And everybody kind of knows the final formal peace, not the de facto peace that is established after the victories at Yorktown, but the formal peace is about to come. And that when that formal peace comes, the Continental Army is going to be sent home. It's going to be dismissed. Americans were very, very suspicious of standing armies, and that included their own. The difficulty here is that those few thousand troops have not been paid for a very, very long time. And there was a lot of resentment amongst the officers in the Continental Army about the way that the Continental Congress had treated them during the war, and the way that the Congress of Confederation had treated them after the fighting had basically come to an end. It had never adequately met their needs in any shape, form, or fashion. And the Congress of the Confederation had promised that there would be pensions for the soldiers and the officers, and those pensions would essentially be half pay for the rest of your life. And for men who had fought this long war, had done all the suffering, the fighting, the bleeding, the dying, they'd taken all the risk, that seemed like a fair and just reward. The difficulty, of course, is that if the Congress is bankrupt, how's it going to do that? And the answer is it's not going to do it. And Congress had not funded the pensions. You have to create investments that can produce dividends so that you can, pay this thing out over a long, long period of time. Congress had not funded those pensions and, in fact, had just rejected proposals to fund those pensions. And there was a real worry amongst the troops, and particularly the officer class, who believed that the pensions were never going to get funded. They were going to be sent home without pay, and then once they were disbanded and sent home, they'd be forgotten about. Thank you. Thanks for creating the country, for risking your lives and your fortunes to do it, but no reward. And that led to a great deal of agitation in the Army and produced something called the Newburgh Conspiracy, which bloomed briefly in March of 1783. And although it's sort of a vague and ambiguous thing, it looked like very much the Army was at least willing to threaten a coup. In other words, if the politicians cannot correctly run the country and meet its obligations, then maybe the soldiers ought to do it. The officers were so put out with the way they've been treated for so long that they kind of reached their limit, or at least some of them, and they came together in Newburgh, New York, to have a meeting in March of 1783 where they're going to draft essentially a proclamation that threatened the Congress. You do what you're supposed to do, or you're going to risk the soldiers taking over. Whether that would have actually happened or not is extremely difficult to say. It seems unlikely, but this is as close as the United States is ever going to get to the possibility of a military coup. And if the threat here was to scare the Congress into doing something, it certainly scared the Congress, but they didn't do quite what was expected. What they did do is they cried loud and long for George Washington, of course, is still commander of the Continental Army. He's not going to take his leave until after the Treaty of Paris is ratified in September of 1783. And Washington, intervenes. He goes in, sort of crashes the meeting of his officers. He walks up in front of them. Of course, those who are talking about, a coup are embarrassed and they're ashamed. And he gets up in front of them and he takes out a prepared speech and he prepares to read it. And then he reaches into his pocket for a pair of reading glasses, which he needed for a long time, but he was sort of a vain guy, didn't like to let people know of his infirmities. And as he puts on these glasses, which is a big shock to a lot of his officers, he said, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind as well." That had an enormous emotional impact. And then Washington basically tells them, look, this isn't what you fought for. This isn't worthy of your dignity and your honor. You did not fight this war for money. You didn't fight this war so that you could have a pension. You fought this war for an idea, for the idea of government, for the idea of government by the consent of governed, for the idea of justice and democracy and these sorts of things. And if you were to act in the way that is now being proposed, you would pull the rug out from under all of that. You would destroy the legacy that you have built and the gratitude that you have earned from the American people. It was an extremely effective address. The officers broke into tears. They rushed to ask Washington to forgive them, which of course he did. And whatever there was of the Newburgh Conspiracy vanished. It vanished right then and there. But nonetheless, how frightening. How frightening. Now, Congress did act after a fashion. Instead of granting half-time pay for life as a pension, they granted the soldiers full pay for 5 years. Still going to have a very hard time funding that. They're actually going to do it by giving the soldiers bonds and not cash. But at least there was some sort of action. But how telling that we're coming this close to the military thinking about throwing the elected officials out and taking over. That's how desperate circumstances have become. And understanding this, some members of Congress said, look, we need to do something. We've got to take some action to get our house in order, to make it possible for the government to function, to make it possible for the government to defend the country, to make it possible for us to pay our troops. And the person who had an idea was Alexander Hamilton of New York. Alexander Hamilton is somebody we're going to get to know very well. Had been one of Washington's key aides during much of the war. He had led an important assault on the British lines at Yorktown. He was himself wealthy and influential. He had been born in the West Indies. He was illegitimate, which of course was a burden to bear in the 18th century. But he'd moved to New York City and done very well for himself. He would do even better. He's going to become one of the most important people in the country. And he's a member of Congress. He's a member of Congress from the state of New York, and he says, look, we've got to do something to enable us to meet our financial obligations and to inspire confidence in the American people. And if we can do those two things, then perhaps we can convince the American people to give us more power that will make us more capable of solving the big problems facing the country. And what Hamilton proposed was an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, that would allow the Congress to levy a 5% tariff on imported goods. Remember, a tariff is simply a tax placed on goods that come into the country. This is a revenue tariff. It's not designed to keep those goods out, to prevent them from competing with American goods. There are very few American goods being manufactured that you have to worry about competition. But 5%, so if you got a nickel off every dollar's worth of goods that come into the country, and lots of goods are coming into the country, those nickels are going to add up. And when those nickels add up, we can not only pay the Army and fund the military, we can also attempt to pay off the national debt. And that was something that would benefit everybody. It would be good for the economy. It'd be good for, the interest and rates and all these sorts of things. And so Hamilton makes this proposal, and it's debated in the Congress. And most people can see the merit in his proposal. And when the time comes to vote, 12 states vote yes, and 1 state votes no. And the state that votes no is Rhode Island. Teeny tiny little Rhode Island, settled by the troublemakers that Massachusetts had exiled back in the early days of colonial settlement. And remember, you have to have unanimous consent. 13 out of 13 states has to accept the idea of an amendment. And 1 state said no, and that was it. So no amendment, no tariff, no income, no paying the troops, no maintaining the military, no paying off the national debt, no gaining the confidence of the American people. And as a consequence of that, Hamilton is distraught, and we've kicked the can down the road, and he warns his fellow congressmen, hey, look, if we don't do something soon to fix this, the United States is going to become, or perhaps it already has become, a laughingstock in the eyes of Europe, weak and insignificant by our dissensions, he says, in the eyes of the rest of the world. And can you imagine a more galling thing to say than that to the people who have just bested England in the Revolutionary War? And so the country continues to drift under the Articles, everyone very well aware that things are going badly, everyone aware that the government doesn't have the power to deal with problems that the country faces, but the states not willing to surrender any of their power or prerogatives to the national government, no one willing to actually act to do anything about it. And in 1785, when Massachusetts said, hey, let's hold a convention, let's get all the states together and figure out if we can't do something to strengthen the Articles of Confederation and the government under the Articles of Confederation to cope with the circumstances we find ourselves in. No state had any interest in it whatsoever. So the country is drifting toward disaster, economically, politically, perhaps militarily, and no one seems to be willing to do anything about it. And that means that a crisis is approaching, a crisis that will either destroy the young republic or give it a new lease on life. And so we're going to pause here, and I promised you that there were going to be some questions. And so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I want you to email me the answers to those questions, okay? This is our way of making sure that you've been listening and paying attention, and this is how we're going to make up for the objective portion of the test. So here is the first question, true or false, okay? So you just want to say true or false, the American government under the Articles of Confederation was a deliberately weak form of government. In other words, it was written to be weak. Is that true or is that false? The second question, the Treaty of Paris required the United States government to compensate loyalists for their losses in the Revolutionary War. Is that true or is that false? And now a fill-in-the-blank question, which state blocked Hamilton's amendment to allow a tariff in the Articles of Confederation? So which state blocked an amendment to the Articles of Confederation that would have allowed the Congress of the Confederation to levy a tariff? So 3 questions, 3 questions. I need the answers to those 3 questions emailed me by each of you, and that way I'll know that you've listened thus far, and we'll be able to start to add up points for your next test. And so we're going to pause here so that you can deal with those questions, and when we come back, we're going to begin the movement toward the Constitution of the United States.